This coming Tuesday, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, will be visiting the White House. And President Trump the other day was on Air Force One, and he was asked about what he hopes to accomplish during this historic meeting.
We're honoring Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince.
What are your goals for the meeting? Have you decided to sell F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia? Are you going to do that?
Well, they want to buy a lot of jets. We make the best jets. We make the best missiles. You saw that when we took out the nuclear capability of Iran.
The jets, are you not sure yet?
I'm looking at that. They've asked me to look at it. They want to buy a lot of 35, but they want to buy actually more than that fighter jets. Yeah.
Will the Abraham Accords be a part of that conversation, perhaps getting
What?
the Abraham Accords, getting Saudi Arabia?
The Abraham Accords will be a part. We're going to be discussing. I hope that Saudi Arabia will be going into the Abraham Accords fairly shortly.
So, Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. Now, at the same time as all this is going on, the United States is presenting a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council, trying to get it passed, that basically calls for the Trump 20-point plan that we've been talking about for weeks to become kind of ratified by the UN Security Council with slight changes. And it's causing a lot of discussion in Israel. This whole issue of, are we trading recognition of a pathway to a Palestinian state, which is part of the Trump 20-point plan? Are we trading that for normalization with Saudi Arabia? Because the way the Israelis, from an Israeli perspective, the way the Israelis see this whole deal is that the United States wants a deal with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is insisting on a pathway to a Palestinian state. The Trump 20-point plan, at the end of the plan, calls for a pathway at some point in the future to a Palestinian state in line with reforms by the Palestinian Authority, although the draft of the resolution to the UN Security Council has not really been made public. Now, there have been calls for a Palestinian state in the context of potential normalization with Saudi Arabia for years. In fact, there was a lot of conversation about that right before October 7th. So the question is right now, is this a real danger to Israel, that maybe there would be a real pathway forward to the Palestinian state? Is Saudi Arabia simply posturing? What exactly is going on here, and what should we expect and be concerned about in the days ahead with this big meeting between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and President Trump? Here to help us make sense of it all is Dr. David Wurmser. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and he is also a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. He has served in positions as a naval intelligence officer in the National Security Council and as a senior advisor on Middle East affairs in multiple White Houses. So Dr. Wurmser knows kind of where the bodies are buried and what the state of play in the Middle East is better than pretty much anybody. So Dr. Wurmser, how do you understand the dynamics right now of this potential for Saudi normalization, potential for Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, and what Israel might have to give up for it? What are everybody's interests in the current situation? Help us make sense of it.
Well, I think everybody's interests are aligned. The problem is not everybody sees their interest. And I think therein lies the problem. Saudi Arabia and Israel, I think, both understand they face a grave strategic threat in the region. And by that, I don't just mean Iran. I mean Qatar and Turkey. And the Palestinian issue has been the issue through which inter-Arab strategic competitions manifest themselves, inter-Islamic strategic competitions manifest themselves, and it's no different here. That essentially the control of the Palestinian issue is really what's between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. And Israel has every interest in making sure that Qatar and Turkey lose. Not necessarily that Saudi Arabia wins, but Qatar and Turkey lose, because they are emerging as a very grave threat to stability in the region.
Hold on, just before you go on, I want to clarify this point, because I've mentioned this in some of my previous videos, and I think it has to be emphasized that Qatar and Turkey are not in the same camp of Arab nations, as it were, of Islamic nations, as the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the others. Even though the American administration seems to treat them all as moderates, the Qataris and the Turks have their own agenda here, and the Saudis actually view them as an adversary. That's the point you're making.
That's exactly the point I'm making. And it's Saudi Arabia's deepest interest to prevent the Palestinian issue from being seized and used by Qatar and Turkey as a bludgeon against them strategically, which is why they have to pay lip service and they have to show some sign of movement toward the Palestinian issue to move ahead. Now, that is sort of the framework. It doesn't really mean Saudi Arabia is all that interested in the Palestinian issue. It is more, it needs to deny that issue to the Qataris and to the Turks. And the problem is the United States doesn't see it like you described. And the best example is the United States doesn't understand the fundamental strategic difference between phase one and phase two and what led to phase one of the ceasefire. Phase one of the ceasefire, where Israel got back its living hostages and should have gotten back all of its hostages, was an act of despair by Qatar and Turkey because Israel was about to destroy Hamas completely. And Israel had shown that it's willing to hit Hamas leadership abroad, including in Qatar and potentially in Turkey, which freaked them out. They were scared of Israel, and they realized they were about to lose their critical strategic asset that gives them control over the Palestinian issue, namely Hamas. So to save Hamas and to save themselves from being threatened by Israel, they were willing to pay the price of giving up the hostages, which obviously Qatar always had control over. Now, phase two is where it's supposed to move toward the dismantling of Hamas. And of course, the whole point of phase one for Qatar and Turkey was to save Hamas. So in phase two, they're strategically at odds. Saudi Arabia in phase two wants Hamas gone because it is Qatar's strategic instrument. So they need it gone. So there's some strategic alignment there. But the point is for Israel that if there's strategic alignment, Israel shouldn't show itself as weak and pay a huge price that is paid in the weakness of Israel or the weakening of Israel in order to bring the Saudis into the tent. The Saudis should in their own interest, work with the Israelis to work against the strategic threats in the region. So if I were Israel, I wouldn't pay such a huge price. The problem is the United States keeps thinking that Saudi Arabia's demand on the Palestinian issue is the absolute irreducible element that moves everything forward. And it's, again, they don't differentiate between the Qatari position, the Saudi position. So therefore, they're pushing toward, unfortunately, in an Obama-like fashion, toward another Palestinian state to move the peace process forward. The same scenario we've been dealing with for 35 years. So in my view, the Saudis don't have really that big an interest. They're much more interested in seeing strategic clarity and strategic sobriety. And the more you go in the direction of giving to the Saudis on the Palestinian issue, the more the Saudis are convinced that Israel and the United States are strategically floundering and less valuable to them as a strategic partner. So the irony is the more Israel gives and the more the United States demands of Israel on the Palestinian issue, the further receding the strategic alliance and peace is with Saudi Arabia.
So you used the term lip service before for the Saudis making this demand for a credible path forward to Palestinian statehood as part of any willingness to normalize with Israel. Now, when you say lip service, do you mean that the Saudis actually, behind closed doors, do not want there to be a Palestinian state and just want this to be, is it kind of like Arab world virtue signaling? What did you mean by that?
Well, I think it's more. It's the Palestinian issue is the language through which the Palestinians or through which the Arabs and Islamic world fight themselves. So you can't just pay lip service. You actually have to show some seriousness on it. But the truth is, the Saudis really have much larger interests and don't. The Palestinian issue is not what they're after. They're after the larger strategic issues, but the Palestinian issue is simply a hurdle they have to work through. Now, that said, it's a hurdle that has its own gravity and therefore strategic threat to them. So while they want to have some sign of movement toward a Palestinian resolution, the truth is they're sober enough to understand that any Palestinian entity that emerges in any sovereign way or even self-governing way right now will be a front for Hamas and therefore a front for their strategic enemies, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey.
Before we go on, be sure to go into the description of this video and download the free ebook that's available there. It is a collection of articles, of columns that I've written that really provide my analysis since the beginning of the October 7th war. And it'll really give you a window into what we've been through since the war began. So go ahead and download that. Now back to the video. So if that's the case, and the Israelis know that, is all of the Israeli protests right now, like we have today, the Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar tweeting this morning that Israel will never accept a Palestinian state, and other cabinet ministers, the finance minister last night, Bezalel Smotrich, also being very adamant, and even using all sorts of shrill tones that Netanyahu working together on this normalization, if it means concessions on a pathway forward to a Palestinian state, oh no, the sky is falling, it's a disaster. If it's true that really the Saudis aren't so serious about it anyway, but they need to say it at this point, if the Israelis are aware of that calculus, is it really much ado about nothing in terms of the Israeli discourse on the subject right now?
Well, it is a little bit much ado about nothing, but there's also more to it than that, because Israel's not only signaling Saudi Arabia, it's signaling to Qatar, Turkey, the Europeans, and the Americans, who, in my view, are going off in the wrong direction on this. And as a result, Israel has to lay down the law. And in general, Israel's strategic interest is such that after October 7th, it should be strategically apparent to everybody that you cannot strategically divide the area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. There is a river to the sea here, and it is one strategic area. And if Israel divides it and hands it over to a Palestinian state, it will be a mortal threat to the state of Israel. You cannot defend it anymore while you give up those areas. So the Israelis have to, with all due respect to the Saudis, the Israelis have to draw a very hard red line to the world and say, don't go there. Don't go there. And it actually helps the Saudis, because they then aren't in the position where they have to say, well, we sort of agree, but we don't want Hamas, and blah, blah, blah. The Saudis then can sort of sit back and say, well, there's no real resolution yet. But the irony is, the real purpose of the relationship with Saudi Arabia is not, it would always help having the Abraham Accords extended, because there's economic cooperation. There's a lot of above the table cooperation, above the surface of the table cooperation that is blocked by not having formal peace. But there's a tremendous amount of under the table strategic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. And that actually can be threatened by prematurely moving toward peace with Saudi Arabia, because it forces the Palestinian issue at this point up front on the table. And then the Saudis have to put forward demands that it knows Israel won't accept, because they actually don't want it resolved, because it would lead to a Qatari dominated proxy. And so it's very complex. Bottom line is, the Saudis are in a strategic threat, a strategic danger to them in the region. And they want strategic clarity from Israel. They want strategic clarity from the United States. They're seeing some of it from Israel. They're not seeing it from the United States. And until they do, they're going to hedge, and they're going to put forward demands they know will never be accepted in order to stall and stall and stall and stall. So I actually think they won't sign a peace treaty anytime soon, precisely because the United States is pushing the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, and the song and dance that the U.S. is doing with the Qataris and the Turks, pretending that they're moderate states, is only confusing the matter and making it more difficult for the Saudis to achieve that clarity. Last question before I let you go. It seems that in this whole convergence of events with this UN Security Council attempt by the United States to ratify their 20-point plan, which they see as a pathway forward to creating this new security force that, of course, hasn't been created yet, that is supposed to, and in the new language, different than the original Trump plan, it now says that that security force is actually going to be engaged in the disarming of Hamas. And I've been adamant since the very beginning that that there is no plan to disarm Hamas, and there's no actual path forward to that. So it could be that all of this conversation about even moving to the very next point in the 20-point plan is all really bluster. And we are going to be stuck in this situation for a while with Hamas on the other side of the yellow line, Israel on the Israel side of the yellow line, and no one wanting to touch the issue of disarming Hamas. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, you see, I see it the way you do. Look, you and I both go back to Oslo days. Frank Gaffney, our other friend, we have a lot of group of people who've been here. We've been around the block a long time, and this has an Oslo feel to it, which is it's unreal. There's something detached from the reality on the ground, and when that happens, it won't work. And then you have, I think, what's really the emerging plan, which is, okay, so let's have status quo. We can't disarm Hamas. Let's just sort of box them in and what's left of Gaza under their control and try to just push ahead on the rest of Gaza. But I think that's also unrealistic because you have a very large population under Israel's control and a large population under Hamas's control, which is a prescription for subversive warfare by Hamas that will eventually force Israel to react. So I think where we are is where we've been since the end of this war a month or two ago, which is the war isn't finished. And Israel will face a choice sooner or later to finish it. And finishing it means the full occupation of Gaza. So I think basically we're just in an interrupted state until reality burns through and the war is finished. The same way, ultimately, I think we're going to see the same sort of forced decisions in Lebanon with Hezbollah and unfortunately also with Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Wurmser. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is going to get its F-35s. So,
well, and then after all that happens, then Saudi Arabia will make peace, but not before.
All right. Thank you, Dr. David Wurmser. So helpful. It really is a hall of mirrors in the Middle East, and you always cut through the fog and help us understand what's actually going on.